Good afternoon. Sorry it's a little dark, but I'm trying to cut the glare from the textbook. Chapter 6 Fur Traders. Current Issues Update. Endangered Species and Land Use. The fur trading era brought the first permanent white settlers to the Pacific Northwest. Fur traders trapped fur bearing animals for their coats, which were sold to markets both home and abroad. They were soon followed by pioneers who came to cultivate the land. The arrival of fur traders and pioneers put humans and animals into direct conflict. Fur traders actively trapped animals faster than they could reproduce. The pioneers created vast pastures out of former forests to hold important livestock. Unfortunately, the new farms were often located in the habitat of wolves, grizzly bears, and mountain lions. Homesteaders killed these animals to protect themselves and their livestock. Today, the effects of this period are still felt. Populations of grizzly bears are low in the Pacific Northwest, as are wolves, cougars, and many others. Federal and state agencies have enacted laws to guard their habitats and lives. In the case of wolves and grizzlies, it has meant the reintroduction of the species to Idaho and the Northern Cascades in Washington and British Columbia, respectively. Such actions have caused outrage among farmers and residents in these areas who see the animals as potentially dangerous. As populations increase in the Pacific Northwest, conflict between man and nature over land will continue to be a major issue as we try and balance the future of both humans and the animals. Keys to understanding. Beaver, small animal whose pelt was very valuable commodity during the fur trading era. High demand for fashionable hats found in cool forested areas near water. Fort Astoria, constructed in 1811 by the Pacific Fur Company at the mouth of the Columbia River, sold in 1813 to the British owned Northwest Fur Company. Fort Vancouver, most important fur trading post and fort in the region, built by Hudson's Bay Company 1824 to 1846, located on the Columbia near Willamette and Lewis Rivers. Hudson's Bay Company, oldest corporation in the world, which was formed in the 1670s, dominated Canada's fur trade, very important role in North America. Dr. John McLaughlin, Hudson's Bay employee at Fort Vancouver Trading Post, very helpful to Oregon pioneers, fur traders, and missionaries. Northwest Fur Company, British owned company that explored, mapped, and developed the Canadian Rockies and Pacific Northwest. Split from the Hudson's Bay but merged in 1821. Pacific Fur Company, owner John Jacob Astor sent two sea expeditions and one land expedition to the Pacific Northwest, established Forts Astoria and Okanogan, U.S. claim. Rocky Mountain Fur Company, early 19th century American owned fur company located in the Rocky Mountains. Individual trappers traded fur for goods at the annual rendezvous. Overview. The Pacific Northwest natural environment provided a near perfect habitat for fur bearing animals. The mountainous terrain, cold winters, dense forests, and abundant fresh and saltwater bodies and sparse human population allowed fur bearing animals to flourish. Early British sea explorers such as James Cook and John Meares recognized and announced the economic benefits of fur trapping and trade. Fur trapping and trading became the region's first important economic activity. The Pacific Northwest's most profitable fur bearing animals were the beaver, sea otter, and fox. These valuable pelts were trapped by Native Americans, Europeans, and Americans. The fur pelts were either bartered for goods and services or purchased. Fur trappers usually went to either fort or trading post or attended an annual summer rendezvous to conduct their business. In exchange for relatively inexpensive consumer goods, the fur pelts could be transported to lucrative markets around the world. To maximize each pelt's value, a fur could be exchanged for silk or spices in the Far East. Silk and spices were extremely valuable when sold in Western Europe. Huge personal wealth could be the result for the trapper and trader alike. Companies and corporations could return vast fortunes to their stockholders and investors. The late 18th and 19th century were boom years because of the high prices and significant demand for pelts. There were four major fur companies operating in the Pacific Northwest between the 1770s and 1850s. These companies were the Hudson's Bay, Northwest, Pacific, and Rocky Mountain. The British-owned Hudson's Bay and Northwest Fur Companies established many important trading posts: Fort Vancouver, Chipewyan, Spokane House, and Kootenai House. These were prominent in the economic success of the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. The American-owned Pacific and Rocky Mountain Fur Companies only trapped the fur-bearing areas of the lower Columbia River and the Rocky Mountains. These companies were instrumental in the region's development. The fur trade era expanded exploration, established settlements, and initiated domestic and international trade. Missionaries and pioneers soon followed. Fur trade era. The first two migrational flows into Pacific Northwest were the Native Americans and the non-native explorers. Because of the explorers' experiences in the region, a third migrational flow followed: the Russian, British, and American fur traders. Native Americans living in the Pacific Northwest for over 14,000 years truly understood the value of fur. They were excellent fur trappers who became shrewd fur traders. Explorers such as Vitus Bering, Alexei Chirkov, John Meares, James Cook, and Lewis and Clark recognized the financial benefits of trading inexpensive goods for fur pelts. It was only a matter of time before traders arrived in the Pacific Northwest to trap and trade furs. The Pacific Northwest's fur trade era was condensed into a historical period from the 1780s to the 1840s. Fur trading companies could make money because the demand for furs was very strong at this time. Coats and hats made from either otter or beaver pelts were very fashionable in Western Europe and the Eastern United States. The Pacific Northwest fur trader had three major markets: Western Europe, Eastern United States, and Northern China. In each market, the demand for furs was very strong, thus allowing fur traders to make large profits. Wealthy Europeans and Americans were very willing to pay high prices for fashionable fur hats and coats. Sea otter and beaver pelts were demanded in northern China for protection from the long, bitter, cold winters. In all of these markets, the consumer paid top price for furs imported from the Pacific Northwest. Trading goods for fur pelts. Between the 1780s and the 1840s, the Pacific Northwest was the site of a brisk and lucrative fur trading business. The region's climate and natural environment were ideal to sport large numbers of fur-bearing animals. In addition, the region was sparsely populated, and thus there was little pressure on the existing environment. Native Americans, French Canadians, mountain men, as well as British and American fur trappers were all harvesting fur-bearing animals. To these individuals, fur pelts had limited value because fur-bearing animals were so plentiful. Furs were used for warmth and protection against the cold weather. However, other Americans, Europeans, and Chinese were willing to pay high prices for these fur pelts. Fur trappers trapped the fur-bearing animal that yielded a valuable fur pelt. Because there were many furs, each pelt had little commercial value until someone was found to buy the fur from the trapper. Fur trade flourished when fur traders brought goods to be exchanged with the fur trappers. Colored cloth, colored beads, guns, ammunition, whiskey, metal objects, and trinkets were designed by the fur trappers, were desired by the fur trappers. The fur trade business thrived when inexpensive goods were exchanged directly for valuable fur pelts. Why would fur trappers barter their valuable furs for cloth, beads, and trinkets? The answer is supply and demand. The fur trappers had an abundant supply of fur pelts, but they rarely had access to other consumer items such as beads, trinkets, cloth, and guns, which they desired. Therefore, trading fur pelts for items they wanted made economic sense. Fur traders had access to cheap trinkets, but not the valuable fur pelts. Exchanging consumer goods for furs satisfied both parties. Fur profits. Pacific Northwest fur traders had many costs, such as ships and their crews, construction costs of fur trading posts, and the basic cost of consumer goods. In addition, fur traders had to transport the furs long distances to the three major markets: the eastern United States, Western Europe, or China. For a quicker profit, fur traders sailed around South America to the markets in the eastern United States or to Western Europe. If they wanted to maximize their returns, they sailed west to China. In China, the sea otter and beaver pelts were traded for tea, silk, spices, and other oriental riches. These goods were loaded aboard the traders' ships for the long and arduous journey to European and American ports. Upon arrival, the oriental goods were sold to buyers at very high prices. The value of the oriental goods was much greater than the prices the fur traders would have received for their own furs in those markets. The fur traders made substantial profits because the cost of furs and pelts was very low compared to the value of silk and spices. Who benefited from the fur trade? Everyone involved in the fur business benefited. All were satisfied. The Native Americans and other fur trappers were much better off because they could now obtain scarce consumer items they needed and wanted. The fur traders and intermediary workers, the seamen, the merchants, and the stockholders were also better off. So here you get a really nice map of all the different trading stations and where all the different companies were. And this is map 6.1 on page 142. However, the original financiers and organizers made fortunes from the fur trade. For example, John Jacob Astor made over 200 million in the current dollars as the owner of the Pacific Fur Company and other fur trade related businesses. The four fur companies. During the fur trade era, four major fur trading companies emerged as fierce competitors in the Pacific Northwest. The four companies were the Pacific Fur Company, the Northwest Fur Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. These companies operated in the Pacific Northwest from 1811 to 1846. The American-owned companies included the Pacific Fur Company and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The British owned the Northwest and the Hudson's Bay Companies. Each company hoped to monopolize the fur trade. However, in the end, all four companies lost to the settlers immigrating into the Pacific Northwest during the 1840s. Why Northwest fur trade boomed. The Europeans and Americans encouraged fur trade in the Pacific Northwest for several reasons. First, the rest of the North American continent had become too populated for trapping. The Pacific Northwest's vast forests and numerous water bodies still teemed with beaver, otter, and fox. The sparse settler population in the region made it much easier to trade with the Native Americans, who provided a ready supply of cheap labor. The Pacific Northwest was accessible to ocean-going ships that could make the shorter journey to the Orient. The region's interior was accessible through its numerous rivers, especially the Columbia River and its tributaries. They were natural highways. Competition between fur companies was minimal because their spheres of influence seldom overlapped. The Native Americans were unaffected by either the American dollar or the English pound. Currency had little to no value to them. Another important factor to the success of the Northwest fur trade boom was that other areas of the country had been extensively trapped. Results. The fur company's lack of foresight and conservation quickly minimized the Pacific Northwest's advantages in the trading industry. This mismanagement of the great fur boom became the fur bust of the mid-19th century. Nonetheless, the fur trade era led to the extensive exploration of the region's vast interior. It also established a profitable economic base and fostered permanent settlements in the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Fur Company. At the beginning of the 19th century, a recent German immigrant, John Jacob Astor, founded the Pacific Fur Company. A successful fur trader and businessman, Astor's dream was to expand his trading activities into the Rockies and the Pacific Northwest. Tonquin Expedition. Astor decided to send a ship to the mouth of the Columbia River to build a trading post. He also sent an overland party to build a chain of trading posts in the Oregon country. Duncan McDougall was chosen by Astor to lead the sea expedition sailing to the mouth of the Columbia River. The Tonquin set sail from New York on August 2, 1810. It reached its destination on March 22, 1811, during a violent storm. The ship's ruthless and impatient captain, Jonathan Thorne, ordered 8 men to enter the mouth of the Columbia in spite of the storm. All 8 died in two attempts to enter the river. Finally, Thorne left Duncan McDougall and a few men to build Fort Astoria on the southern shore of the Columbia River in present-day Oregon. Captain Thorne and his 26-man crew sailed north to Nootka Sound, where they were all killed by local Native Americans. Overland Expedition. Astor's overland expedition was led by Wilson Price Hunt and Donald Mackenzie. They left St. Louis in 1810 and finally reached Fort Astoria in 1812. The expedition was nearly a total disaster. The men fought hostile Native Americans, struggled through a harsh environment, suffered from hunger, and were poorly led by Hunt. The expedition split into several smaller groups. Some went back east, some deserted, while others sought refuge at Fort Astoria. Mackenzie's group arrived at Fort Astoria first. Other groups, led by Hunt and John Day, did not reach Fort Astoria until several months later. Thus, amidst tragedy and hardship, the Pacific Fur Company had established itself in the Pacific Northwest. Astorians. Between 1811 and 1813, the Astorians constructed and managed trading posts at Fort Astoria, Fort Okanogan, and Fort Spokane. In 1813, the Astorians received word that Great Britain and the United States were at war. This was the War of 1812. The only 2 fur companies west of the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Fur Company and the Northwest Fur Company, were owned by 2 warring countries, the United States and Great Britain, respectively. Representatives of the Northwest Fur Company offered to purchase the holdings of the Pacific Fur Company before the British government sent a warship to confiscate them. British Duncan MacDougall agreed after the arrival of the British sloop Raccoon on December 12, 1813. With the Pacific Fur Company's sale of its possessions and trading rights to Northwest Fur Company, the brief, sad chapter of the historians in the Pacific Northwest was closed. Immediately, the Nor'westers changed the name of Fort Astoria to Fort George after the reigning British King George III. The Northwest Fur Company. The Northwest Fur Company was a newly formed British company that controlled the fur trade west of the Canadian Rockies. The Northwest Fur Company was formed by the merger of several small independent fur trading groups in 1784. The company was primarily made up of men who had split away from the largest fur company in Canada, the Hudson's Bay Fur Company. The Nor'westers concentrated on trapping and trading in Western Canada, particularly in the Canadian Rockies. The trappers and traders for the Northwest Fur Company contributed a great deal to the exploration and settlement of Western Canada. The three most prominent employees of the Northwest Fur Company were Alexander Mackenzie, Simon Fraser, and David Thompson. All three explorers sought headwaters of the Columbia River and to map the river's course. Alexander Mackenzie. Alexander Mackenzie was in charge of Fort Chippewa on Lake Athabasca. In 1789, he sought the Northwest Passage by canoeing down a stream flowing from the Great Slave Lake in Canada. The river, however, was not the Columbia. It flowed due north, entering the Arctic Ocean. Mackenzie's discovery is now named the Mackenzie River. Mackenzie returned to England in 1789 for additional study and training. In 1793, he returned to Fort Chippewa to again attempt to locate the Great River of the West. He again failed to find the Columbia, but he discovered the Upper Fraser River and the Bella Coola River. Mackenzie stimulated interest that led to other expeditions. Simon Fraser. In 1808, Simon Fraser and a crew of 23 men continued down the Upper Fraser River, which was discovered by Mackenzie in 1793. Fraser and his party, enduring many hardships and dangers, finally followed the main course of the Fraser River to the Pacific. Fraser realized that the mouth of the Fraser River entered the ocean far too north, near present-day Vancouver, British Columbia, to be the mouth of the Columbia River. The main course of the Columbia had yet to be found. David Thompson. The Northwest Fur Company's most noted employee and explorer, David Thompson, made a famous discovery. For 13 years, Thompson explored, trapped, and mapped the Peace and Saskatchewan rivers area at the central Canadian Rockies. Thompson, a former employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, was a brilliant map maker and explorer. He was personally credited with mapping nearly 100 square miles, 2.6 million square kilometers of present-day Canada. In 1807, David Thompson discovered the source of the Columbia River. The Columbia's headwaters are located in southern British Columbia. In the same year, Thompson discovered that the Kootenai River and constructed the Kootenai House, a trading post. During the next few years, he built posts at Kalispell House and Salish House. In 1810, Thompson, learning that John Jacob Astor, a fur trade competitor, planned to build a trading post, Fort Astoria, near the mouth of the Columbia River, continued his mapping expedition along the Columbia. Along the way, Thompson traveled down the Kootenai River to the Spokane House before continuing along the Columbia. Thompson and his men arrived at Fort Astoria on July 15, 1811, shortly after Astor's men had constructed Fort Astoria and its fur trading post. Thompson was too late. Astor's fort strengthened United States claims to the mouth of the Columbia, thereby denying Britain's strong claim. The most important results of Thompson's exploration were the strengthening of both the British and Northwest Fur Company's claims to the upper Columbia River area and to the interior of the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. His exploration of this region played an important role in Great Britain's claim. His work for Great Britain matched the importance of the Lewis and Clark expedition for the United States. Results. The Northwest Fur Company made many contributions during its explorations of the Pacific Northwest between 1784 and 1821. It brought Fort Astoria in 1813, then changed its name to Fort George. They had a fur trade monopoly in the Pacific Northwest until merging with the Hudson's Bay Company in 1821. Even after the merger, the Nor'wester Adventure, Pete Gilleen Ogden, continued explorations of the United States far west from 1824 to 1831. The Hudson's Bay Company. The largest and most successful trading company was the Hudson's Bay Company. It is still operating today. The company was founded by Groseilliers and Radisson in 1670. The Hudson's Bay men trapped furs and traded goods with the Native Americans, earning huge profits for the London stockholders. After merging with the Northwest Fur Company in 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company monopolized the region's declining fur trade. Their only competition came from a few mountain men working in the Rockies. Fort Vancouver. By 1824, the Hudson's Bay Company decided to move its headquarters from Fort George, the former Fort Astoria, to Fort Vancouver. It offered a better location. Near to the mouth of the Cowlitz, Lewis and Willamette rivers, Fort Vancouver was closer to the main source of furs, and it was in a protected area 100 miles inland from the mouth of the Columbia. The inland location proved to be important. Naval vessels could not easily threaten Fort Vancouver as the British had done at Fort George in 1812 and 1813, and as the United States had threatened in 1817. Dr. John McLaughlin. Fort Vancouver, under the capable leadership of Dr. John McLaughlin, became the most active, successful, and important community in the Pacific Northwest. From 1824 to 1846, Dr. John McLaughlin and the Hudson's Bay Company were the source of economic aid and legal advice for Americans and British settlers in Oregon. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The fourth participating fur company was formed by Major Andrew Henry and General William Ashley in 1823. This was the unique Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Several unique aspects of this company were the individualism and independence of its trappers, the lack of permanent trading posts, and the annual summer rendezvous. And the structural looseness of the company's organization. By 1826, Ashley and Henry sold their interest to Jedediah Smith, William Sublette, and David Jackson. Mountain Men. The mountain men of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company were hardy and fiercely independent. Among the most famous were John Colter, Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, Benjamin Bonneville, Jeremiah Johnson, and the Sublette brothers. These and many lesser-known men fought the rugged terrain, harsh environment, and the Native Americans to eke out a subsistent but independent way of life. These mountain men were responsible for the establishment of the Oregon Trail and the discovery and naming of numerous physical features and mountain passes, as well as future wagon and trade routes. Results. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company was not successful financially. The company, along with other minor attempts by John Jacob Astor, Captain Bonneville, and Nathaniel Wyeth, could not avoid the inevitable. The fur era lasted about a half century, but the economic foundation was laid for the future attraction of farmers, miners, loggers, and fishermen. And you'll see pictures here in your book of the big summer rendezvous. Rendezvous. The trapper met the trader at the annual fur rendezvous. The rendezvous moved from site to site each year, but most were held in Wyoming's Green River Valley. Somehow, word traveled fast in the wilderness. Anyone really wanting to go to the rendezvous did. Once traders brought their goods on pack animals until 1831, when they used wagons. Traders brought blankets, coffee, sugar, guns, gunpowder, lead, and of course trinkets to trade. The trappers brought their year's accumulation of beaver and other animal pelts. The rendezvous was the mountain men's annual social event. They raced horses, danced, drank lots of whiskey, and behaved wildly. Many died in fights or accidents. Kit Carson, Jim Bridger, and the Sublette brothers, nearly every mountain man, was there for the rendezvous. So were the missionaries. Dr. Marcus Whitman removed an arrowhead from Bridger's back that he had carried for years. With each rendezvous, the wedge of exploration was driven deeper into the Oregon Territory. By the time of the last rendezvous in 1840, the fur trade had collapsed. The trappers' trails had become roads, the missionaries had established their missions in the territory, and the settlers were not far behind. And that's the end of chapter 6.